Good afternoon, everyone. It is 3 o'clock, and it is time for us to begin our brown bag lunch. I think this is our 10th brown bag lunch for 2018, and I want to say that the turnout has been tremendous. Today we have 140 phone lines registered from throughout of our companies, and that usually represents between 3 and 10 people a phone line. So you can imagine we're probably 500-600 people strong listening to this conversation. No fear there, Margaret. I want to, first of all, give you a little bit of you can see that some people have been writing in the chat room on the bottom. In fact, I am going to show you right now. I'm just going to type chat room and hit it, and you can ask questions or make comments throughout the entire conversation by communicating through the chat room. You can also ask specific questions by emailing me at LUTZ@fedcap.org. I'm not sure I introduced myself, but my name is Lori Lutz, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer of Fedcap, and I am honored to facilitate this conversation today. Margaret Cleveland comes to us with a very diverse background in all things HR and lots of a significant body of work in really building culture and in analyzing culture and in thinking about culture and in writing about culture. Margaret serves us in multiple capacities at the Fedcap Group. She is the head of our strategic communications. She is the moderator, facilitator, and faculty member of our Leadership Academy. Margaret is my right-hand person as we develop our annual reports and our press releases and many, many of our writing endeavors. And she also is a public speaker and speaks around the country on different topics that I think really will feed into this conversation today. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Margaret Cleveland.
Thank you so much, Laurie. I can't tell you how excited I am to be here talking about this very topic, because in fact it really is very, very near and dear to me. So thank you, Laurie, for the opportunity to do this, and thank you all for attending. And I am really looking forward to your questions and comments, and our format is pretty informal. I have things that I want to cover, but I really welcome your questions. And my hope, too, is that we leave our discussion today just a little bit different than how we came in, that hopefully there's some learning or some gems that we can all share that will have some meaning for you and will create a little impact for you as we think about creating a positive can-do culture. This topic really came to me. I used to work in a school department, and there was a very open area where we sat, and I was kind of overseeing some of the community life programming, and then there was up front was a batch of wonderful intake people who saw people as they came in and who answered the telephones. But over a period of time, the phone would ring, and I would be hanging out with them up front, and the phone would ring, and they'd look at the phone, and they would just say, shut up, when the phone would ring. And in fact, this was kind of their job, was to be with the public and to answer calls. And so over time, it really became a thing where it was really clear that we had this whole kind of culture of complaint. And I will readily admit that I got sucked right into it, too, and that most of the day was spent complaining about what she said or what our boss had done or this person who came in from the public. And it really became how we spent our days. And so it was fascinating because I noticed it one day, and I said, you guys, what would happen if we were to spend the whole day not complaining? And everybody just, well, what are you talking about? We don't do that. So I said, well, let's be really conscious of that. Let's see what happens if we don't complain. And sure enough, the next day, it was a really quiet day. And people, they didn't have stuff to talk about because we were so mired in this culture. And so we really created a deliberate conversation about, is this really how we want to be working together? Is this really how we want to be serving? Why are we doing this in the first place? And so it was really interesting how we were able to shift the culture just by noticing some of the things that we did. So this became really in my consciousness about really living culture, and how do we create together a whole different kind of culture in positive and can-do. So here's what we're going to talk about today, and I just wanted to acknowledge Kyle Kay, who is our dear technician today, who will be moving the slides along. So Kyle, thank you so much. And so this is what we're going to talk about, is we're going to look at some facts around what culture is and some really interesting statistics, because as we know, and we'll talk about, culture is kind of a nebulous thing, but there are statistics that really reflect the kinds of impact that culture has on the workplace. So we'll talk about those. We'll talk about, after talking about all of these, we'll sort of distill them into what we call kind of the pillars of what culture is, and then not only that, but what the drivers are. So it may be all fine and good to say that communication is a good thing, but how do we drive that? How do we create that to create a can-do? And then I have collected sort of a very brief and informal survey of some of the comments from many of the folks that may well be on the line about your impression of what the Fedcap culture is. So that's kind of an interesting moment. And then we'll talk about some other pieces that reflect your questions and some other things that really do have an impact. And then really look at, so what? So what's the so what on this, and what's next, and what can we all be doing to make a difference in this? So the next slide is kind of my mantra by Annie Dillard. How we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. How we spend our days is how we spend our lives. And so this is really important, because are we spending our lives in fulfilling and productive ways? And if not, how's that working for us? And if so, what can we do to make it even better? So being, again, really deliberate about thinking about that question, I think is really important. So let's think about, what is culture anyway? And so these are just a few words, but if you ask people, and you'll see on our slide a little later, the reflection of those who work at Fedcap of what it is, a lot of people think it's just this fuzzy thing. And it's like, well, it's just, it's just fuzzy. And in fact, it is all of these things and more. But part of our goal today is really to try to distill it into something really more concrete, so that we really can talk about it in a concrete kind of way. And what we know is that people come together in an organization with this great collision of values, and we all have different values, and we bring them with us, and sometimes we talk about them. Sometimes we're not even sure of what they are, but they definitely all impact how we feel about culture. And people bring what they have been used to, what they're entitled to, and some of this can create a problem too sometimes, because conflict around space, around values, around relationships, around competency, all of these things can create some kind of tension in the workplace. And if we don't talk about it and we don't be really deliberate about it, then it can really impact our culture. But if you look at the actual definition, which our friend Mr. Webster gives us, he talks about, this is what the definition, the dictionary definition is, that culture is an integrated pattern of human knowledge, belief, and behavior. And I think we would really emphasize this concept of behavior. And again, this is the official definition. It's around customs and beliefs, certainly of various cultural groups and material traits. And it's shared attitudes and values and goals and practices, and that's really kind of the emphasis around the workplace, and basically our collective set of values and practices. So that's kind of the official definition, but again, we really want to dig in today and think about what this means for us, and specifically what this means about creating kind of a can-do culture. But what in reality, and if we look at the next slide, this is what culture really is. It's the everyday reality of our lives. And it's the sum total of this crazy DNA of all of us, of which there are 4,000 plus of us in all states and in many, many programs with 14 different agencies, all of whom have their own cultures. So it is the sum total of all of that. So what does that look like? And one of the pieces around this, and certainly the most important fact, and one thing I wanted to say too, is that culture is more about what we do, not about what we say. And it's learned by the actions that we take. And subcultures can really be created in the absence of something really specific. And we're going to really talk about that more. But this slide talks about the less so fuzzy, the not so fuzzy, because in fact, culture is the X factor. It is the secret sauce that makes all the difference in the success of the company. And there's been a ton of research about this. Gallup has done polls, many, many polls. Great Place to Work, which is a fascinating organization that focuses on culture and how do you live it, how do you breathe it, and how do you bring it to life. And many others have come together. And if you're comparing two organizations or 2,002 organizations who basically, whether they're for-profit or not-for-profit, who have the same mission and vision, purpose, services, products, the ones that have the stronger, can-do, positive culture are the ones that fare better. And it's every single time this is what works. So there are some really interesting statistics that go with this, and they're not pretty. Get this. This is not a typo. Poor culture, and this can be measured, costs businesses $300 billion per year. And this is in things like absenteeism, turnover, healthcare, management issues. If you have a good culture, you don't have to be constantly managing problems and areas. And certainly in healthcare, if people are unhappy at work, they bring their stress, their healthcare costs go up. I remember working for an organization once where something like 90% of the 1,200 people that worked there were on some kind of drug to try to create less stress, to try to alleviate their stress, which is quite a stat. So there's time to look at the culture. Turnover rates are really, really expensive. And it costs in here, you'll see it's $25,000. If you have a $55,000 person at that salary, it costs almost half of what they earn just to turn over. So that's a huge expense. And absenteeism, of course, is an issue. People don't show up for their work because they don't feel like coming into work. And so these other numbers, people don't feel engaged, they don't feel motivated. And then this is a slide that's got a little something for everyone because also you have a decrease in operating income or a decrease in earnings growth. So all of these things can be impacted by culture. And one of the things that's really interesting, I wanted to say something about this too, about another ugly stat, is that when we have work-related conversations, this is fascinating to me, 80% of the conversations we have are about the past, and 15% are about the present, and 5% are about the future. So think for a minute about the impact of that on culture and on where we're going. And if you're looking at the past, you're often thinking what was done, and we get this kind of done to quality where we feel like things have been done to us and we rehash things, or we look at, certainly debriefing some work that we've done and thinking about what did we do and what can we do better is a perfectly great conversation, but that's also about looking to the future. But if we have the done-tos, or if we also, this talking about the past really breeds this concept of they and we. And that is a really key factor in the kind of conversations that we have. Think how many times all of us have said, well, they, who are they? And what if we were to replace that word they with we? What a difference that would make. So I don't know if, so now these are the happier stats that go with this. And
Margaret, this is Lori,
okay.
and I wonder, Kyle, I wonder if you could go back to the slide before, because I just got a question. What is it that you think causes 80% of the conversation, work-related conversation, to be focused on the past? What is that about our psyche, maybe our spirit, that creates that, and how can we intentionally change that?
Oh gosh, I wish we could get everyone to answer that question, because I'd be fascinated to hear from everybody what they think about that, and you too, Lori, because it's certainly, the past is something at least we have collectively in our consciousness, so we all have a shared understanding of the past, and we've had time to think about it, we've had time to process it, and we've had time to bring our layer of interpretation to it. And that's easier than, you think about just history. You think of all the interpretations of history. And people, nowadays people are writing a little more about the present, but I think it's something that's more of the known than the unknown, perhaps. That might be part of it. And certainly thinking about the future, there's an unknown quality there, and that's true of any kind of thinking about change. There's an unknown quality, and I think sometimes we don't think we have control over what even the present or the future looks like. And that goes back to that thing of, well, they, as opposed to what do we want to co-create. Does that make sense, Laura?
Yeah, I think it makes sense, and I actually think that, for me, that statistic struck a lot. And I wonder if it wouldn't be an interesting part of our day in and day out, kind of examination of how we each individually contribute to culture, to reflect on that. When you're in a world where you're telling a lot of stories and trying to really engage people in understanding the history of an organization, you do spend a lot of time thinking about its history and the merits of its history and its journey. And you think about the contributions that people have given us. When you're launching a new program, I think you're thinking about what we've done in the past and what worked and what didn't work. And again, I think that's all valuable. So part of me wondered if the conversation around the past was necessarily negative, but what it does do is it keeps our eyes focused in the rearview mirror instead of the front mirror. And I think that there is a lovely balance that we need to achieve there. We cannot repeat. If we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it. We all know that. And then if in fact we spend too much time there, then I think we stop our ability to learn. So I just think this statistic is interesting and bears some discussion in the teams that are meeting throughout the country.
I think that's a great idea, and I think there'll be hopefully there'll be quite a few little nuggets that we can incorporate into some of those conversations. But I think that's and I know Chris has talked a lot about the idea of looking in the rearview mirror as opposed to looking forward, because we have to constantly be looking ahead at what's next and what's next. And it's not just the leaders that have to be doing that, it's all of us, because we all have a huge influence. And that's kind of a theme too, because in a lot of the things that I've read and over the years about culture too, people often point to the leaders and say it's the leaders who create culture only. It's the leaders who create culture. And certainly it is true that leaders model culture. And sometimes, and for all of us who are leaders, we have to know that whatever it is we're doing, people are noticing. And I think in leadership, that is particularly a strong thing. And I would say that that's true of all of us under any circumstances, is that people watch us, and it's what we do, once again, rather even more than what we say. So for example, if I send a note to someone and say, please get back to me, and they do or they don't, and then I don't get back to them because they've asked me to, that affects my credibility. And so credibility is a huge piece of this too. So you've got me thinking about all this kind of stuff, so we can keep going. But anyway, now back to the happy stats. So thank you, Laurie, for that. And again, if you have any other questions that jump in, and people, folks, I really hope you will feel free to jump in on the chats too. But these are really remarkable about the stats, and the happy stats are really about when you're working in a positive and a constructive and a can-do culture. These are the kinds of things that can result. And there are fewer sick days. People want to get up and come to work. People are more engaged. There's less turnover, which is, again, I mentioned that earlier, that the turnover thing is very, very expensive. And imagine. And then there's just this idea of more energy, both personally but kinetically kinesthetically through the organization, too, that there's just more, people bring more energy. And 106%, that's a rather large amount. Higher productivity. And people just feel basically more satisfied. And again, how you spend your days is how you spend your life. And if you're unhappy coming to work, think how that will then reflect back to your lives and your family life, or your whoever it is that you live with life, or your animal life, whatever it is. It certainly makes a big impact. And then the other piece again is around health and well-being, and then this rise in operating income and the rise in earnings. So these are very, very important. And again, this is a slide that's for everybody, because so many people will say, oh, it's so soft, but it's not. These are stats that have been tracked for years, and this is a fairly updated version of saying. So it really does make a difference. So let's look at so we've talked about all these different pieces and some of this different language, but my thinking in creating this for us all was to really distill it down into what are the real pillars of culture and what matters the most. And there's a lot of them still. There's 10, at least in my little bit of pillars. But undergirding all of it, and most important, is about trust. And trust is the absolute, trust is the absolute foundation of creating a can-do and a positive culture. And for a lot of us, that has different kinds of meaning, but it basically means that we can rely on each other, we can rely on the systems, we can rely on the processes, and we rely on ourselves and our leaders and our colleagues to do what we say we're going to do, to be relied upon, and to hold us up, basically to hold us up and to carry us forward. Trust is, again, absolutely the number one thing, and Kouzes and Posner, who wrote the Leadership Challenge, talk about trust being and credibility being the absolute number one attribute of a great leader. So as we talk about purpose, this really is about uniting us together around the why. Why do we come to work every day? And the answer is hopefully somewhat the same for all of us. And we know what our mission is, and we know why we're here, and we know that every day, no matter where we sit in this organization, we are making a difference. And sometimes I've heard people talk about corporate services, for example. In the corporate services, well, we don't necessarily touch the people we serve. But that's not true, because corporate services, for example, is absolutely holding up those who are in the front lines of the programs. And the folks everywhere we are coming to work because we care about an organization that cares about eliminating barriers for economic well-being in all of our agencies. This is why we are who we are and why we do what we do. And there's no question that that is a piece of uniting us in our culture. The second, of course, is communication, and this is another huge one way up at the top. And we're going to talk a little bit more a little later about how that is part of our drivers. But obviously communication is key. And not just often, but also open. And we'll talk again a little bit more about what that looks like. But in the absence of communication, boy, don't we all project. We just make stuff up all the time. If we don't understand what people are thinking, we read body language in ways that we shouldn't. We think about when there's a disaster and we don't hear from something, we just project it when there's a serious something that goes on. So communication is obviously absolutely key, often and open, and that takes practice, and it takes a lot of courage. And it takes, and one thing that is, I think, really exciting is how we have been opening up communication so much more in our organization, because again, as we spread over all 50 states and 14 different agencies, it's critical that we all know what's going on and that we have kind of a dashboard. And so our intranet, for example, is a really great tool for us. And we'll talk a little bit more, too, about technology and how that impacts culture in just a little bit. Transparency is obviously important. We have a wonderful, we're a model for nonprofits around our financial transparency, where we do our financial releases. And I believe, Laurie, it's twice a year that we do that, right? Is that right? I think twice a year that we do that. And so everybody that is a stakeholder with us knows where we stand. And so it's not just also about the financial, although that's a huge piece because you can't mess with those numbers, but also transparency in what we are bringing of ourselves to our jobs every day, and being really open and being willing to reflect back on our mistakes and being transparent about being nervous or about being worried. But again, as leaders, we want to make sure that we're telling people what's going to help make them buoy them up. And authenticity goes really right with that, so that we are vulnerable. And if any of you are familiar with Brené Brown and her work, she's a wonderful researcher who researches the concept of vulnerability and shame. And she talks about how we are all imperfect, and if we could find the gifts of our imperfection, she has a book of that name. And I know those of you who know her are probably nodding your head, because even though she's been around a lot and written a lot of books, there's not one trite thing about her that she certainly underscores this concept of vulnerability. So I urge you to check out her YouTubes. on that. Another pillar is, of course, around learning. And one thing we know, I always laugh when people say, well, what do the millennials want? But I think the millennials want what we all want, but there's certainly a clear edict from a generation and the next generation after that. It's hard to believe that's happening, but that we all want opportunities for professional development, and particularly as people are moving through an organization, they want to learn more, they want to contribute more, and being really, really intentional about how are we helping people learn and how are we supporting their learning and how are we supporting their development is a key piece. Innovation.
Margaret?
Go ahead. Yeah, jump in.
Margaret, I have a question. Someone said vulnerability and authenticity sound great, but is it safe? And how do you operate in this kind of transparency and authenticity and ultimately vulnerability when you feel like if you admit mistakes, the question says that, you'll pay for it?
Mm-hmm. Well, that goes right back to the concept of culture, and that is something I think, and again, I welcome your thought too on this, Laurie, but that we need to talk about and be really deliberate about our intention around this, and that's true of all of these 10 pillars, is that we welcome that openness. We want this to be one of our undergirding principles. And, it's an interesting, as I think a lot of times people do fear if they speak up that they could be in trouble. And I think the how we do that, and I that's a whole other workshop about kind of how do we speak up in ways that is going to be the most constructive and the most productive, and not just venting, for example. But I think I can't think of any reason why, if someone asks a question that comes from great critical thinking and great openness, that wouldn't be received. And if it isn't, then that's a conversation that I think we have to have and be reflected to whomever it is that we're concerned about. But it's not like that easy. I get that, and certainly that is one of the areas where the subculture can really emerge, can really come into play, where we say this, but it's what we do that matters. And so as leaders, and as particularly as leaders, I think this is a particular underscore spot where we have to demonstrate this in order for people to see what it looks like, and in our own demonstration of that also helps people to feel safe. And I think that's part of it. And again, I think there's certainly a longer conversation. And Laurie, if you have thoughts about that, or anybody else too, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because it's a really important conversation. Any other thoughts on that, Laurie, from you?
I just got an email, and I love this point where the individual said, well, actually, if we think about it, everyone's a leader. Every single position in the agency has a role and a responsibility. And so if, and I'm keying off that and suggesting that being vulnerable, being authentic, being transparent is, it's been my observation that if one person in a team can be that way, it is amazingly contagious. The idea that I blew it, I made a mistake, this is something that I don't do very well, whatever those words might be, if we can feel comfortable saying those words, what a freeing thing it is. So I think that I would agree with you that one could always look for a leader to role model, but isn't it just great if we believe that every single member of a team has equal responsibility in pushing forward the concept of transparency and authenticity? It's probably a driver of culture in and of itself, so thank you.
Absolutely. No, absolutely, and thank you so much for that comment, because really one of the undergirding pieces of this whole conversation, and again, I made reference to people talking about how it's supposed to be leaders who drive culture, but absolutely that point is exactly right, is that we all have a responsibility, because otherwise we get the done-tos. We think, oh, these are things happening to us. We have agency in our lives and in our teams, and it's up to us to help work and establish those pillars of trust. So that's really, really key. And so we talked a little about learning and professional development, and then the idea of innovation. And again, when people are feeling safe and comfortable that they can speak up and they can be at work and they are looking forward to being there, there's this thing that happens, this kind of relaxed that happens. And I know, part of our culture is not just lying around thinking up things by any means. We do have certainly a drive underneath what we do, but innovation comes out of creativity. And I think Chris had talked about this at some point fairly recently about creating white space in your day or in your week. And one of her blogs, I think, of late was talking about spending 5 hours a week in 5 hours, like 1 hour a day in learning. And that also breeds thinking about being creative and innovation, because if we're learning and taking things in, then we're going to get our juices going and we're going to innovate and we're going to come up with the, well, what if we, and again, being very specific about incorporating that maybe into team meetings and saying, what are some things that you're seeing from outside and external sources? What are some things that your friends are talking about that we might be able to apply here? And again, this obviously has to do with process improvement, but it also has to do with how can we not be looking through that rearview mirror, but look forward, what's the next thing, and to really be conscious of what's happening out in our external environment and what can we bring in and how do we be creative. The other piece, too, around this pillar is around appreciation. And for those who are in the Leadership Academy, they know that we're in the midst of our final module for this year called Encouraging the Heart. So that is something we are deliberately speaking about in the Leadership Academy. And appreciation comes in many forms. And there's stats about appreciation, which is that people would much rather, like something like 83% of people would rather be praised and appreciated and acknowledged and given feedback than they would given gifts, or and that can also mitigate a frustration around finances. That appreciation goes a really, really long way, and the currency of appreciation is huge. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. Well-being obviously is a pillar of culture. We want people to be healthy and feel safe, and well-being is a obviously essential piece of that. And how can we incorporate into our organization opportunities for well-being? And I know Rob Ryder, I think you're on our call, but if you're not, I'll speak for you. But I know that there was a time last year where Rob was doing this early morning for people when they wanted to come in, some yoga classes. For anybody who wanted to, it certainly wasn't mandatory, but it not only made people feel healthier, but it also brought the team together in ways that they certainly wouldn't have considered. And so well-being comes in many, many forms. Our environment is a huge piece too, obviously, and we'll be talking about that a little bit more, but space is very important, and Grant Collins has talked about this a lot when he talks about creating spaces that are welcoming not only for the people we serve, but also for us as employees and as staff, and how important space plays. And this is another one of those millennial stats, is that this concept of open and collaborative spaces where people can talk together, and then also places where people can have some privacy in a hotel space. And certainly the work we're doing at 633 in breaking down some of the silos, breaking down some of the walls, and also still creating some safe and quiet, which is what I really meant, private spots. They're all safe, is a really important element, so that you have choices about how you work and how we work together. And then, of course, leadership, which we've already talked a little bit about, and how important that does, a role that does play. But underscoring, Laurie, what you said earlier, too, it isn't just about leadership, it's about all of us. So these pillars, and again, we could spend days, and my hope is that we can really dig in our teams to talking about each one of these things and what do these look like, but looking at these as really the undergirding principles and the pillars of culture. If we were to concentrate on each of these and what they look like, and how do we make these into a positive experience for all of us, with trust as the absolute undergirding principle, because without trust, nothing's going to move forward. So, so those are our pillars. So thinking about the pillars, but now we move to what are the drivers. And so this is about how do we get there? How do we, and again, we can talk about this a lot, but what are some of the things we can do to get there? And We talk about transparent communication, and this goes back to, Laura, your question earlier that you got about how important it is to be able to speak up, to have productive conflict. I grew up in a family where nobody talked about anything that was about conflict, which made me really interested in how do we do conflict, because everybody just went, I'm fine, no, fine, when you know perfectly well they're not. It's like one of the most passive-aggressive ways of speaking you can get. And so it became really interesting to me because because we didn't talk about it a lot, it became this big, scary thing. And so I really made it my mission to learn how to do conflict, and I love to do mediation, and I love productive conflict, because what it is the bringing together of two different value sets, or two different, really it's value sets, and how do you bring them together, and how do you figure out a way to acknowledge and learn about and be ultimately curious about not only your own feelings, but the feelings of someone else. And I swear if we could all figure out how to do conflict really well, we'd be in a very different place. And going from conflict, it then evolves into a concept of generative dialogue, meaning that we co-create dialogue. And certainly in this day and age, we all seem to be taking stands about things, and we don't, how are we going to learn anything, and how are we going to move anything if we're not listening to each other, and we're not really acknowledging what that looks like. And so so generating a dialogue and really being a convener of the conversation, as opposed to I'm going to force someone to think my way. We all know what that's like. We just back up and we just take our stand even more. So how do we really be deliberate about that? And then going back to your question before about creating a safe place to have authentic expression. And then this kind of Buddhist idea about listening to other people with what they call this concept of soft eyes, which is not judgment, but really keeping an open heart. And it's a really almost a spiritual thing of how do you truly stand in witness to another person, and how do you truly reflect them. And we do this all the time with the people we serve. We do it all the time. We work with them without judgment, and we listen to them, and that's something we all learn. That's what we do. And we take it from there, and we meet them where they are, and then we help them get where they want to be, and to help them achieve their dreams in the power possible. And we bring our open heart, and we bring our soft eyes, and this is something we need to be doing and want to be doing with each other as well, and in our workplace. So if we do that, it makes a huge difference. And then there's this whole thing about feedback. And again, we could talk for hours about feedback too. We are reluctant and we procrastinate on giving feedback because we are nice people and we don't want to hurt people's feelings. And there's a way to do that. And again, we'll have to do more brown bag lunches on things like this, because it really is, it's such a great topic around feedback. And think about when you've been given either really positive feedback, or when someone has observed something that you've done and said, I'm wondering about this, or this thing that you did made me feel a little bit uncomfortable, and I just wonder if that was your intention. And feedback is often so much about intention versus impact, because I would say 99.9% of the time, people are not out there trying to make you feel bad. And so we think, what was their intention, and acknowledging their intention, and then what was the impact, and then just explaining what that impact is could make a big difference. Laura, did you want to jump in? Or that was
well, I had a person emailed just and kind of made an interesting concept about the idea of productive conflict and how this feels like an oxymoron. I love the email. And in fact, so what I wanted to just chat with, or maybe even get some people responding on the chat room, is the idea that, do you see the correlation between an open, transparent communication environment and can-do? Do you see that connection? Because you're getting just a great base understanding of the concept of culture, how while it is not fluffy, it may feel amorphous. Although, funny thing is, when you walk into a room full of people, boy, can you feel culture. It can almost feel palpable. But But in addition to really beginning to understand this concept of culture and your role in it and how you contribute to it, I'm wondering if people really understand or think there's value in the relationship between transparency and communication and a can-do culture. And I think that there's an important conversation to be had there, that do we link those two? Or, in fact, when we seem to have a team that's stuck, when we're diagnosing what's wrong, do we look at communication, commitment to purpose, accountability, results? And so I just wonder if people could either in the chat room or in email to me talk a little bit about why they think there is such an inextricable link, if they think there is, between open, transparent communication and a can-do culture. And I'm wondering if people have thoughts about that. And Margaret, if you have thoughts about that.
Well, and certainly I think I do, because I think that that they really are siblings, not even cousins, they're even closer than that, that transparency and vulnerability means that you are expressing how you feel and how you think, and that and it's true, it's honest. And so certainly that is going to generate conversation. And again, these are the drivers. All these four things basically lead to trust and lead to great results. And so, so I certainly think that they are very much together. And our pal from NVLE had written, so when you give negative feedback, you'll find that the person had a good reason for that behavior. And so again, that comes out of being curious and being honestly curious about where someone is coming from. And I would even challenge the word negative feedback and call it productive feedback, as opposed to negative, because negative would puts people on the defensive. But Lori, I'll be interested in some of the comments you may get as a result of your question. So that was great. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, go ahead. Was that you? Were you taking a breath? But so that transparent communication, I think, has got to be one of the absolute. So foundation is trust, and in order to build trust, you have to be able to have open, transparent communication in this form of the ways that I've just talked about. And once you have open and transparent communication, that also leads to a collective commitment to purpose. And that's, again, understanding the why, being really clear about what the expectations are of each other, not just from our managers, but what are the expectations that we have together as a team. And I've worked with many teams where we talk about this, and then we draw up a contract. And we talk about what will happen, and this comes to accountability too, but what are the expectations that we have for us? And this also is about strategy and where do we want to be? And what are our roles that we play in this? And how do we feel engaged and passionate about the mission? And are we collectively on the same page about what the mission is? I mean, I think, this may be even about a project. It's not just the overarching mission, but what is it we hope to accomplish by X project? What is it we hope that we're doing, and are we making sure that we're all committed together to that purpose? Are we linked arms that we say, yes, we are going to work together? And if we are committed, then we have to really look at accountability. And accountability is another very near and dear topic, because it's so easy to say, yep, that's what we did, but then not take responsibility. And that's about going back to that thing I talked about earlier about credibility, and as that our credibility is our word, and that sounds sort of dramatic, but it's pretty obvious. I mean, if we don't do what we say we're going to do, if we don't take ownership of our own actions and of our reactions, and that goes also to, I'm having this reaction, but I think this is where it comes from. I mean, almost, and sticking to agreements, meeting deadlines, following through, getting back to people, all of those pieces are around accountability. And again, these are the drivers that need to be talked about. And we keep, so often, people talk about the results and the bottom line, but they don't talk about the how. And to me, that how is the culture, and it's the secret sauce. And it's how we get things done is how we create our culture. And ultimately, if we have trust, we can have these conversations, we show our commitment, we are accountable, and then we get our results much better, which not only is around our mission results of the power of possible, but it builds innovation, it builds creativity, it creates a great place to work, it creates a, what is it called, an employer of choice, and it creates extraordinary results for the people we serve, which we're really good at already, but even more so if we ourselves are feeling well fed by each other. It creates better systems, and it creates more leverage of all of us working together to build our muscle and our strength to stand for and call for the things that are important to us in our mission. And ultimately, I really believe this, it's a better world, and it's not just for the people we serve, but and anybody who talks to me for more than 5 minutes, when we talk about this, it's the generations that our impact will have. It will change whole courses of lives that we do. So these are, I think, this is the most important drivers, and these are the most important conversations in service to getting to those pillars and really building those pillars. Go ahead.
Margaret, thank you. There's Patrick Lencioni is one of my favorite authors. He talks a lot. Yep, it does. I thought it might be. And one of the things that Lencioni talks about is this idea of team members being accountable to one another. Mm-hmm. And that for me rings true and has a lot of, I think, merit and wisdom behind it. The idea that it is only the leader of a team that holds one another accountable for a set of tasks is so fundamentally missing the boat. If we are a team, and we are, for example, and I'll use an example that for one of the teams that I'm involved in right now, we're smack dab in the middle of that, and that is putting on, let's say, a major gala. And we expect 750 people to be in the room, and we need to raise $750,000. And every single person who's a part of the team that has an assignment to help achieve that goal is fundamentally responsible for its success. It's not just one person, it's every single one of us, and any one of us who fall down on our collective responsibilities impacts the whole. And I wonder if you have ideas, and probably this goes back to vulnerability and authenticity and transparency and communications, but think how hard it is to hold a team member accountable. And yet, in the absence of doing that, I'm not sure it's positive to create a can-do culture, because I would imagine there are people listening on the phone right now who are a part of a team and they pour their heart and soul in, and there's one or two members of the team who don't hold up their weight, and the murmurs start, and that becomes the kind of the focus is what people aren't doing as opposed to all the incredible work that is happening. So, I think there's conversations to be had, I hope, around the entire organization around how courageous it is to stand up and say, you're a member of this team and you didn't do what you said you were going to do, which directly impacted me. And the person that's saying it isn't, quote unquote, the formal leader of the team. They're just a strong member of the team. And I think that's a real hard piece of the puzzle to maybe put together when you're trying to create this can-do culture.
But you know what, too, Lori, is that, I've done this with groups where we create a team charter, basically. And in it we talk about how are we going to agree, how are we going to disagree, how are we going to, what are the things that we're striving for, what does it look like, and how are we going to hold each other accountable. And so we actually have live and in-person conversations about what is it we're going to do when one of us is falling down, because sometimes things happen and people get sick or a family member is sick and they have to step away. How are we going to fill that gap? But not only that, but how are we going to fill it when someone is not doing what they said they were going to do? And so then you have that as really a blueprint, that charter as a blueprint, being very, very specific. And that it would be, it's the backdrop against which you then can talk about it. So that takes some of the onus off the courage part, because it's just saying, we said we were going to get all this done and that this was our deadline, and now it's not. first of all, curious, is something going on? But secondly, this is making, as you said, Laurie, an impact that is huge and going to be very, very important. And so that's a huge piece of the culture. And a lot of this, too, around building trust is about knowing who we are as human beings and understanding what drives us. And again, talking about the how and being very specific. And this piece around creating a team charter is really powerful stuff, because then, again, it's the backdrop. It becomes the thing you can go back to, and that no matter where you sit on the team, you can say, we talked about this and this isn't happening. What can we do to make this better? Or where are you with this? Or this isn't working for us, and you're not holding yourself. So it can be a positive can-do conversation, but it also needs to be had. It's definitely important to be had. So thank you for that.
This concept of having a charter is just a great idea, especially when you're venturing out on a brand new endeavor. And even if we're not talking about a 5-page charter, we're talking about just some agreed upon ways in which we're going to act. And I love that Gary said he loved the fact that you mentioned the idea of that this is a muscle. It's as muscle as much as any leg muscle or arm muscle, and that muscles need to be exercised, and the ability of holding our team accountable for good and bad, celebration and direct, clear statements is a muscle that we need to exercise. Thanks for that, Gary.
Yeah, thank you, Gary, for that always. And you know what, I'm reminded, too, that Gary and I had a conversation at one point when we were talking before about some of the stats, some of the ugly stats, and we talked about absenteeism, and one of the great consequences of not having a culture is this thing called presenteeism. And that's when people show up, but they're really not there. And if they're not feeling that they can have open conversation, that they're not committed, that they don't feel accountable, or they don't feel their team is, or that, who cares what the results are, people may show up, but they're not there. And that is almost worse than people not being there at all, because you keep thinking you can rely on them. So acknowledge and kudos to Gary around that concept. I meant to talk about it a little earlier. So how do we get there is our next slide. How do we get there? So these are our drivers. And so there are those who would say culture just happens. It just happens. And of course, if we if we just let it happen, and we create basically a void. And into the void, we often project things like my friends in the school department, and we project into the void, and we sometimes project that negativity. And we create a subculture almost, and that becomes the culture. So it's really important that we create a structure, which really reflects back on what we've been talking about being really deliberate. And gee, that whole concept of structure, I've heard that somewhere before, and I think we know where that came from. And again, creating a structure, oh, of course, it's that famous person whose mantra is, good people fail in the absence of structure. And if you've ever been in the room with Christine McMahon for more than 10 minutes, that is really her mantra. And it's absolutely, I repeat this all the time to people, because it's true. If we don't know, if we don't have these pillars, if we're not being deliberate, and we haven't created structure, so how do we do that? So let's move forward, because this is talking a little bit about how we build it. So the first thing is, and again, this is just reinforcing what we've been talking about, is that we define it with our teams. And this goes back to I have an example of the team charter. If anybody wants a copy, I'm happy to send it along. And of course, you just adapt it to your own project. But I've done that in other workplaces where we actually, as you suggested, Laurie, every time we start a project, we create a charter which says, what does success look like? How are we going to know it? How are we going to assess it? So defining what it is when we want to build that culture. We want to talk about what we want to accomplish, but we also want to talk about how. How do we want to drive our can-do? And again, this is not just about the leaders. This is about all of us. And again, what happens when we don't live up to our agreement? So that's going really quite close to what we've just been talking about. Another way to build it is to teach it. And this we do starting with our new employee orientation. And one of the ways that you teach it, it's not really sort of an instruction sort of thing, is by telling stories. And I am a great fan of when you're having a group meeting, a team meeting, that we take time to talk about mission moments and to celebrate. That's part of celebrating what we do, but that helps to teach our culture, and not just about the things that we do for the people that we serve, and those are absolutely fabulous stories, and we want to hear those, but something that happened as a result of our internal working culture. What are some stories about something that we see? And of course, our new initiative, semi-new, about Let's Hear It for Our Staff is a wonderful way to tell those stories. And who of us doesn't want to be one of those people that gets the Let's Hear It for the Staff? How great does that make you feel? And how great does it make you feel to have someone acknowledge you? And so those stories are a really big piece of building can-do culture. And again, there are mechanisms that we have throughout the organization to do that. Now, living it is, of course, all about going back to what we do, not necessarily what we say, but what we do. And we all exhibit culture. And how this goes back to about, again, this is just kind of talking a lot, we've covered a lot of this too, about how do we live it, how do we model it, how do we make a decision. And I think about this too, that when I get dressed in the morning and I'm going into work, I don this extra layer of clothes, which is my attitude that I want to bring with me. And that's really important, because otherwise we just kind of wing it. But being really clear about what does it mean to live it. And we all have hard days. I mean, let's not be Pollyanna about this either. We have days when we don't feel great, or we're depressed about something, or something's happened. And that's when, because we've built a can-do culture, we rely on our workmates and say, I'm having a tough day. Can you carry this a little bit? And then they know that we're going to do the same for us. And we all can exhibit that can-do culture. And how it's about how do we respond, and how do we give feedback. And inspiring it really is pretty clear. Again, it's how do we tell the stories? How do we hold our other friends up? How do we inspire something positive? And how do we act in any setting by reflecting what it is that we see that might be positive, or reflecting something that we see that may not be reflecting the can-do spirit that we want it to do. And then this idea of measuring it, it is measurable. And thinking of the key drivers and the indicators. So for example, the things in our happy stats, and our positive stats, and even the ones in the negative stats, we can measure whether the can-do culture is working by the same mechanisms that we have these reports. So looking at turnover, for example, looking at who is taking advantage, or how many are taking advantage of professional development. And not only that, but what is the impact of that? Are people moving in the company and moving in directions that they want to be moving in? Do we have individual development plans that we work with our supervisors around? Do we, some of the Oracle modules we're talking about incorporating along the way, we'll be able to measure some of these things, and they'll really create a dashboard for us. How many hits do we hit on the internet, intranet, not the internet, please. There's only 40 million gazillion of those on the intranet. How much are we participating and using that as a tool? And so if we complain and say, gee, nobody ever tells me anything, have we been on the internet? Have we looked at what some of the news is? And we have all kinds of news that comes over the internet, and that certainly affects our company. And then ultimately, how do we reward it? And again, I think I quoted this stat a little earlier, that 83% of people would rather have praise than a present. And 40% of people, this is still from the Gallup poll, say that they would invest more energy in their work if they were acknowledged and hopefully praised more often and paid attention to. We all want to be acknowledged and affirmed and accepted, and those are really, and appreciated. We all want that. And so doing that for each other is how we're going to, again, hold each other up through the good times and through the tough times. And so these are some of the building blocks, if you will, for creating a can-do culture. And again, the most important and deliberate piece around this is talking about it, just like we are today. So the next slide is really interesting. This was, I really appreciate those who were able to get back to me. I asked the question, if you were going to describe the culture of Fedcap to a friend who doesn't know the company, what would you say? So I wanted to give you a chance to kind of take a look at these, and some of them are extraordinary and positive and far-reaching, and some of them, there's one over here on the far right-hand side where somebody said, we're not connected, and someone else said, we are connected. And so by virtue of the fact that we have this great collision of values and people coming together with different perspectives, these are just some of the things that I got. But if we can begin to hone the pillars that we've talked about, we can begin to underscore the drivers and really talk about it, we'll be able to answer this where we're all linked together to say we have a can-do culture that reflects learning, and it reflects vision, and it reflects innovation, and it reflects great communication, so that we can all agree. And again, we're people in Texas, and we're in California, and we're in Florida. We're in very different regions, and in Maine, where there are regional differences in terms of the personality. And we have some offices where the dress code, for example, is very informal. And when you come into Manhattan to our spot, the dress code is less casual. It's not casual. And so understanding what some of those pieces are, but I think this is a really interesting list. And for the areas that are not feeling as positive, where they're feeling imbalanced or where they're feeling strict, one of the great comments that I got too that I wasn't able to include in the slide was that we are dynamic and infectious. And but it was very clear that the infectious was not in a bad way, but in a good way, and that we're very forward thinking. And that something that we do really well is involve our staff in the company's success and in our influence. And there are opportunities abounding for some of these things. The Leadership Academy, the Solution Series, streaming the brown bag lunches like today, and various other events that take place around. There are opportunities, and we have to look for them so we can be sure to be included in that. And so here's the question. So this is sort of where we are now, but where do we want to be? And if we move to the next slide, what changes can we do to move toward where we want to be? What choices can we make? Can we do? What behaviors can we do that we can change and think about that can really reflect where we want to be? What learning can we do? And what future can we do? I did the can do so that would obviously reinforce our theme. But, you know, what future? A lot of this is what changes can we create? What choices can we create? What behaviors can we do? And what future can we create? And so, and Laurie, I don't know if you wanted to talk for a minute about this concept of creating kind of an experiment. You know, what is one thing even that we can do differently tomorrow? And I'm going to ask you that as our last question, but what can we do a little bit differently? And imagine if we were to take one thing that we do differently and we spread it. There are over 4,000 of us, and we get back and talk about what is it we tried, did it work, and if it didn't work, what can we do differently? And this goes to this concept of the PDSA. And Laurie, did you want to say anything about that? I know that is a particular favorite of yours.
Quickly, it goes back to some work that was initiated at the Institute for Health Improvement in Boston, and the idea was everybody was trying to figure out how to change the incredibly long wait times in emergency rooms. And I'm not sure if that issue has been formally and forever resolved, but the idea was that, you know, lots of times we sit down and we have this big plan, and the plan takes forever to develop, and it's got all these details and all these action points, and that's all well and good, and it's often very necessary. Sometimes system change, culture change can occur by just one person doing one thing differently. One person saying hello in the morning to someone whom they normally don't say hello to. One person sending an email of thanks at the end of the week. One person saying, hey, listen, I really appreciated how you did this. One person having the courage to say, hey, listen, I was really relying on you, and you didn't meet the deadline, and I didn't even know you weren't going to meet it. And I need you. I need your work is a part of my work, and so on and so forth. Just one thing that we have to do differently. Otherwise, it feels so overwhelming. It feels like it's just so much. But I can do one thing differently. Everyone can do one thing differently, and that is the engine that drives this idea of creating a positive can-do culture. And there have been what are called learning collaboratives done around the country on this concept of doing one thing differently. So I really want to encourage all of you, if you feel like you want to be a part of changing the culture within which you work, then my encouragement is to leave today with a plan to do something differently tomorrow.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And so just some other things just to mention, obviously, that have to do with culture, and I just wanted to speak to this concept of failure, because creating a can-do positive culture, also in teams, things go wrong. Things don't happen the way we want them to happen. And so in the Leadership Academy, we talk about this a lot, and our own friend Michael Jordan has talked about failing over and over, and that's why he succeeded. And Thomas Edison talked about the fact that he had 10,000 tries before he invented the light bulb. I guess there's some controversy, but he had help. But anyway, but he looked at it, instead of saying, I failed 10,000 times, he said, I figured out 10,000 ways not to do it. I learned 10,000 ways not to do it. So really taking our mindset around failure and looking at it as a learning is really huge. And it's something which I hear from the senior staff that is where they are with it. And Laura, you can agree because I've heard it from you, and I've heard it from Chris, that failure really is about learning how do we do it better next time, and what do we do when something happens. And so often, how we create a can-do culture is in how we respond to this hard stuff. How do we respond to something going unexpected in front of us? And so that piece is really important. The other piece is the space, which you may recognize this space. It was a work in progress at 633. And again, that's a big piece of culture, and we did mention that. But I can't wait to see that in all its glory. And also the other piece is around how we hire people. And I've worked in organizations where there are people who interview a prospective employee for their content and technical knowledge. And then there's a whole other team that just talks to them about whether they're going to be a culture fit. But you have to know what the culture is and what you're trying to fit into in order to get there. And that takes a lot of deliberate action, as we've been talking about. And so looking at our new hires through the lens of culture is very, very important, because otherwise it's like you get ink in the wash, and you may have a beautiful wash, but you have one little drop of ink, and we know what happens. And so, and someone may be coming into the organization that is a lovely person, but they don't see things in the same way that we do in culture. So that, again, that's an ongoing and deliberate conversation. That's what Great Place to Work does, is they have a massive employee climate survey that they do to really get how employees feel. And I hope one day we can get to that point where we're able to really measure some of these things, and then look at where the areas are that we need to improve. Technology is another piece, of course, and one of the questions that someone had asked me prior to talking about all this was, what role does technology play? Because in some ways it distances us, because now we can work more remotely, and obviously it creates a better platform for communication. And we all need to be learning how to do that better. And of course, as time goes on and we're able to do asynchronous meetings, that kind of thing, we can see each other. I know when my son went to college and I was absolutely bereft, and I was so grateful for Skype because I could see whether he was eating or whether he was skinny or how his room looked and those sorts of things. So having the technology to be able to correspond can really bring us closer together, and it can also, again, create a distance. But if we use it correctly, we certainly will be able to, that will certainly contribute to a positive culture. And then again, is the data. We talked about that already, about what is the data we need to know in order to help us move the needle on our culture. and how do we use that information, and how do we get back, and how do we incorporate the idea of creating a culture that we want into our daily lives and throughout the organization, just so that it becomes one of the things that we do. And some people would, again, we go back to our earlier slides, suggest, oh, it's a soft stuff. But we know from the data, we know all of it, that in fact it is the secret sauce, and it's the thing that's going to make us feel good. So so I go back to Laurie's questions in my last slide here, which is, I would ask you, and I would love it if you type into the box, but if not, send a note. But as a result of this conversation, what might you do differently with, and hopefully my undergirding hope was that you would leave just a little bit differently at 4:15 than you did coming in. And so I'm hoping that something has resonated for you, and that understanding the how we do things is important sometimes as the what, so that we make sure it's not only about results, but it's also about how we spend our days and how we spend our lives. And I love the idea that I get to spend my days and my lives working alongside all of you, and I so appreciate being able to be here. And if there are any questions or any other thing, we have a couple more minutes, and I'd love to hear your voices through Laurie's questions and whatever works. So again, I hope that you continue to spend your days productively and happily and supporting each other and moving ahead, so that we are changing lives for those we serve and for each other. So that's where we are. Any other thoughts, Laurie?
Boy, Margaret, thank you so much. I just think there's a million nuggets of gold in this, and I hope for everyone, you all walked away with something that was near and dear to you. For me, it is truly the idea that as a team member, I have the responsibility. As a team member, it's my job. It's not anybody else's job. It's my job. And so I think that is my nugget of gold, and I really appreciate the way you tell the stories and the way you share the information. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I've gotten other feedback from people coming in saying this was great, wonderful. Thank you. So thank you, Margaret, so much. And everyone have an absolutely great day. And we'll have another Brown Bag Lunch coming up in December. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.